Hello class and welcome back. So last lecture we discussed crime and incarceration. So we learned about crime rates in the United States, we learned about the dramatic drop in crime over the last decades, and we explored the equally dramatic rise in mass incarceration. So in today's lecture we are going to pick up right where we left off with mass incarceration. But today we're going to dig into the consequences of mass incarceration. So how does it affect families and communities as well as the individuals who are incarcerated themselves? We're going to ask, what does the latest social science tell us about the effects of mass incarceration? And what do we still not yet know? Then we're going to do a bit of a deeper dive into the reading for today, which was first this landmark study by the late sociologist Eva Pager, which was entitled The Mark of a Criminal Record, which demonstrated not only the consequences of mass incarceration for individuals, but the enormity of the racial disparities that affect Black men in the labor market. So then we're going to end class by touching on an issue that has really gripped America over the last several months, particularly this summer following the mass protests in response to the murder of George Floyd. So we're going to talk about a few facts and figures that we know about police violence, and we're also going to discuss kind of the difficulty of getting good data on police violence. For today's class, I had assigned an interview with the sociologist Pat Sharkey. So Sharkey is a sociologist at Princeton University who studies crime and policing, and I really think his interview provides really good summary of some of what we know about the effects of policing on communities, as well as a discussion on potential policy solutions. We're also going to be returning to this theme in more detail over the next weeks when we discuss social movements and their role in politics. Okay, so let's jump right in. So for today's class, we are going to discuss some of what we know about the consequences of mass incarceration. First for families, for communities, and then for the individuals themselves. So as we discussed last week, mass incarceration in the United States has dramatically climbed since the 1970s. So along with the increasing numbers of people who are incarcerated, and that's disproportionately men of color, the children of individuals who are incarcerated have also been affected. So what's happened is that as more people have become incarcerated, more families and more children have had direct experience with and direct exposure to the prison system. So this graph here shows the number of children under the age of 18 with an incarcerated parent. So research by Bruce Western and Chris Wildeman have shown that this number has grown 5 times since 1980, such that by the time you get to 2012, you had 3 to 4% of children, that's about 1 in 25 American children, who had a parent who had been incarcerated at some point. According to recent estimates, more than 50% of those in prison have minor children. So this is an astounding number of children affected, and increasingly researchers have been trying to understand the consequences for these children of having a parent incarcerated. So just like we discussed last week, a crucial question to understanding the effects of mass incarceration for families is to understand what is the risk that a child will have a parent who is incarcerated at some point during his or her childhood. So this graph here shows the cumulative risk that a child will have a parent incarcerated by the time he or she is 17, and how that cumulative risk has changed over time. So as you'd perhaps expect, as mass incarceration has increased, this risk has also increased. But the levels here and how they are broken down by race are extremely important to understand mass incarceration's disparate effects. So for children born in 1980, so individuals who are about 40 years old now, the cumulative risk for white, Black, and Hispanic children of having a parent incarcerated was less than 5%. So Black children still had about 3 times the risk of having a parent incarcerated than white children, so about 3.6% to about 1% among white children. But as you can see here, by the time you get to children that are born in 2000, this risk has since exploded, and so has the racial disparity in the risk. So for children born in 2000, so young adults who are about 20 years old today, among white children, the chance of having a parent that was incarcerated had increased from less than 1% in the 1980s to around 3 to 4%, so it had grown 3 to 4-fold. For Black children, however, the risk of having a parent incarcerated by the time they were 17 was 20%. And for Hispanic children, this is 10%. These numbers reflect both a racial story as well as a class story. So we can further break down these risks by educational level of the children's parents. So this graph here is based on a slightly different data, but it tells essentially the same narrative. These data, by the way, are for children who were born in 1990, so adults who are about 30 years old now. What you see on the left is the cumulative risk for having a parent in prison by the age of 14 for white children. And that's broken down by whether or not the parent was a high school dropout, so in purple, whether or not they had a high school degree in blue, or had obtained some college, which is in green. So what you see here is that for white children with a parent who had some college, the chance that the parent would be in incarceration were basically near zero. For white children whose parents were a high school dropout, the chance that the parent would be incarcerated at some point was some point before the child is 14 was about 7.5%. For Black children, these numbers are several times that. So for Black children whose parents had obtained some college, so in green here, the percent chance that a parent would be incarcerated at some point was about 13%. So higher than that of white children whose parents had dropped out of high school. For Black children whose fathers had gotten a high school diploma but not attended college, about 20% of those children would experience having their father at prison at some point during their childhood. And the rate among Black children whose father had dropped out of high school was 50%. So 50% of those children could expect their father to be incarcerated at some point in their childhood before they had turned 14. So much of this literature tends to focus on the incarceration of fathers because incarceration among men is so much more common than among women. But this data here, which has been compiled by the sociologist Christopher Wildeman, also calculates the risk of mothers being incarcerated. So for Black children whose mothers had dropped out of high school, they had a 5% chance of having that mother incarcerated while they were children. For their white peers, this risk was only about 1%. With this number of children affected, research has tried to understand what are the intergenerational consequences of incarceration. So by intergenerational consequences, I mean what are the effects of incarceration of the children who, what are the effects of incarceration on the children whose parents were incarcerated? So we know that parental incarceration has negative consequences for children's behavioral outcomes, for their educational outcomes, and also for their health outcomes. We also know that the consequences exist above and beyond the individual risk factors which are associated with incarceration. So what I mean here is that we know that the effects of having a parent being incarcerated for children exist above and beyond the effects of living in poverty or unemployment or substance abuse, all of things which are associated with having a parent incarcerated in the first place. And we know that incarceration is what we can call a mechanism of social stratification, which means that because poor children and children of color are more likely to have a parent incarcerated, the effects of that incarceration can exist across generations, deepening what is already existing social stratification. Okay, so why is that the case, theoretically? There's a lot of reasons to expect why parental incarceration leads to negative effects for children. So on average, parental incarceration reduces family income. It takes a parent out of the workforce and it can be a significant expense for already struggling families. Parental incarceration also can increase strains on the parental relationship. So we know it can be difficult for the remaining parent to retain close ties to the incarcerated parent or to keep children in contact with the incarcerated parent. We also know that incarceration is associated with relationship dissolution among couples. And it can also lead to stress in parenting. Finally, we know that parental incarceration affects mental health. It affects the mental health of the incarcerated parent as well as that of the family. So incarceration generates new sources of stress among families, many of which are already experiencing significant economic distress. So these are all pathways through which parental incarceration can ultimately affect a child's well-being. And research has shown that these negative effects on children do in fact occur. So for example, this data is from a study of children who live in western North Carolina in the Appalachian region. And this study followed them from when they were about 9 till about 30. The study found significant effects for children's mental health and economic and social well-being. So for example, children of parents who were incarcerated were much more likely to have an anxiety disorder. They were much more likely to use drugs, and they were much more likely to eventually be charged with a crime or felony themselves than their otherwise similar peers who had not had a parent incarcerated. Children who had a parent incarcerated were also much more likely to drop out of high school. So 25% dropped out of high school, compared to 5% of otherwise similar children. And finally, these children were also much more likely to grow up to be young parents themselves, and were much more likely to end up as low income. So these results, as well as a whole body of literature has shown similar negative consequences for children, really all point to the high social cost of incarceration, costs that may reverberate for generations. But recently, scholars have been investigating the consequences of mass incarceration for communities. That is, incarceration affects not only the individuals who are incarcerated and their immediate families, but the neighborhoods and communities from which those incarcerated individuals live, as well as the neighborhoods and communities to which those incarcerated individuals return. Okay, what these studies have found is that incarceration is extremely geographically concentrated. And it's concentrated in communities that are oftentimes already disadvantaged along other metrics. So communities that struggle to absorb these kind of additional adversities and problems created by mass incarceration. So this map here shows the geographic concentration of mass incarceration in New York City. So this data is from 2010, when New York had an overall prison admission rate of about 1.8 people admitted to prison per 1,000 residents. But what this graph shows is that overall rate, like about 2 per 1,000, really disguises significant geographic variation at the local level. So this red color here, where you see red on this map, this is neighborhoods where the rate of incarceration is about 6 per 1,000 adults. So that's 3 times higher than the citywide average. Here we can see that incarceration is concentrated in neighborhoods like Central and East Harlem in Manhattan, as well as Bed-Stuy in East New York. So these are communities that are largely Black and Hispanic, and which have high degrees of concentrated poverty as well. So one study by Cordero and Schwartz in 2000 found that in certain Brooklyn residential blocks, approximately 10% of men aged 16 to 44 were admitted to prison or to jail each year. By contrast, many neighborhoods in the city, as you can see on this map, are virtually incarceration free. So for example, most of Queens, Staten Island. Overall, just 15 of the city's 65 community districts account for more than half of those sent to prison over the course of the year. These communities have twice the poverty rate of the rest of the city, and they're more than 90% minority, compared with less than 60% among all those other remaining areas. So this graph shows us just geographic concentration in New York City. But this kind of concentration is basically the norm in most American cities. So whether or not I pull up the graph for Chicago or Houston or Boston or Baltimore, one thing to know is that incarceration is very spatially concentrated. So there's a debate in the literature about the effect of this geographic concentration, specifically about whether or not incarceration in a neighborhood lowers the crime rate or potentially actually increases it. So the crime reduction hypothesis is based on the idea that taking individuals who've committed crimes off the street will incapacitate that individual from committing additional crimes and may even deter further crime among others. By contrast, the alternative hypothesis is that actually incarceration can be criminogenic, or in other words, exert this positive effect on crime in neighborhoods. So why would that be? So according to this view, high rates of incarceration could disrupt a community's stability. It could weaken the forces of informal social control that results in more crime down the line. So thus far, studies on these hypotheses, trying to understand the effect of incarceration on crime rates in that community, have yielded pretty mixed results. For example, in one study in New York City, researchers found that there was no effect of incarceration on homicide rates at the neighborhood level. Another study, which was done in Baltimore, found that incarceration reduced crime at the neighborhood level. So at the current moment, it doesn't seem like there's a clear answer, and results are pretty dependent on the city that's studied as well as how the researchers examine the data. That said, another way to evaluate geographic concentration in incarceration is through the lens of cost. What else could one do with the money and resources that go into heavily policed areas? So some scholars have been investigating the cost of incarcerating so many people from such small geographic units and have referred to these areas as million-dollar blocks. So million-dollar blocks are places where the state and city were spending more than $1 million a year in a given block to send people to prison and to jail each year, on average for between 2 to 3 years. So it's $1 million a year per block. So the red blocks on this map here show blocks in New York City where the city and government are spending upwards of $1 million a block a year. One benefit of this $1 million block initiative was it made clear to local policymakers and organizations where social services could really be concentrated and potentially make a big difference. The creators of this $1 million block study have said that looking at the maps in this way have helped legislators to move towards conversations about, you're already spending so much money in these areas, how could these dollars be potentially spent differently? Okay, so let's transition to now talking about the consequences of mass incarceration for individuals. So I asked you to read for today a paper by the late sociologist Diva Pager, this landmark study which causally demonstrated the effect of incarceration for job seekers and the large degree to which those effects depended on a person's race. So to give you an overview of the study, I'm going to play a video in which Pager herself discusses her analysis.
There are currently more than 2 million people incarcerated in this country, and the United States now has the highest rate of incarceration in the world. The problem of mass incarceration directly translates into a problem of prisoner reentry. With over 700,000 individuals being released from prison each year, we've got a huge population that is struggling to find work and to reintegrate into society. What I wanted to do was to find out how the effect of a criminal record might influence people's chances of finding a job and how that process may differ depending on the race of the job applicant. We know that ex-offenders have, on average, poor employment outcomes, but we know very little about why. Ex-offenders have low levels of schooling, they have little or spotty work experience. On average, ex-offenders are more likely to have problems with substance abuse and mental illness. All of these things can contribute to having trouble finding and keeping a steady job. And so in order to isolate the effect of a criminal record from all of these other associated characteristics, I turned to an experiment. So specifically, I'm using what's called an experimental audit study. And the basic design of an audit involves sending matched pairs of job applicants, who are also referred to as testers, to apply for real job openings in order to see how employers respond to otherwise equally qualified applicants who differ only according to their selected characteristics, in this case, according to their race or criminal background. I hired a pair of young white men and a pair of young black men, and for each pair, I randomly assigned one individual in the pair a criminal record. What this means is none of the young men in the study who were posing as job applicants actually had criminal records in real life. But for the purposes of these applications, they communicated to employers that they had a felony conviction. Most job applications have a question on the application form that asks, have you ever been convicted of a felony? So the testers, when applying for these jobs, checked the box, yes, I have been convicted of a felony, and explained their conviction, that they'd spent 18 months in prison and that they'd just been released in the previous month. Then each week, the applicant pair alternated who presented himself as having the criminal record. And this is important that we were able to randomly assign the criminal record to testers, because if there was anything about the individual testers that might have made them more or less appealing from one another, we didn't want that to be confounding the effect of the criminal record. So we tried to match the testers on every dimension possible that we could think of. But if there was something that we didn't notice or that we left out, this ability to randomly assign the criminal record required meant that each tester served in the criminal record condition for an equal number of cases. So looking first at the outcomes for white testers, we see that about 34% of whites with no criminal record received a callback or job offer, compared to just 17% of whites with a criminal record. So we see that a criminal record reduces employment opportunities by about 50%. In the case of black testers, 14% of those with no criminal background received a callback or job offer, relative to just 5% of blacks with a criminal record. When we compare the outcomes of black and white testers side by side, what's most striking is the direct effect of race on the outcomes of these young men. A black applicant with no criminal background received callbacks or job offers at about half the rate of an equally qualified white applicant. But the most surprising finding was really related to blacks with no criminal background relative to whites with a felony conviction. We find that a white applicant with a felony conviction fared just as well, if not better, relative to a black applicant with a clean record. This suggests that being black in America today is essentially like having a felony conviction in terms of one's chances of finding employment. The massive expansion in the criminal justice system has not affected all groups equally. Today's system of incarceration is characterized by large racial disparities. About 12% of young black men are incarcerated at any given time, compared to less than 2% of young white men. About 1 in 3 young black men will spend time in prison at some point during his lifetime, and for young black male high school dropouts, that figure is close to 60%. So incarceration is becoming an increasingly common event in the life course trajectory of young disadvantaged men. These results point to the incredibly large and lingering effects of direct racial discrimination in this country, and in fact point to the criminal justice system as an important mechanism of stratification among young black men today. The United States has engaged in this grand experiment with the buildup of mass incarceration, but very little thought went into what happens when these people come out. We know that finding quality, steady employment is the number one predictor of whether or not an individual returns to prison after having been released. So if we want to keep these individuals crime-free, if we want to keep them from returning to prison, helping ex-offenders find employment is a number one priority. One thing we could do is to ban the box. That essentially means removing the question from application forms that asks applicants about their criminal record. What this does is to allow job applicants to make a personal impression on employers before being judged on the basis of their criminal record. In my study, the testers who actually had a chance to talk to employers and get to know them before revealing their criminal record had much better employment outcomes. Employers had a chance to get to know them based on their actual qualifications before ruling them out on the basis of that single characteristic. If we care about poverty and racial inequality, we need to think about the criminal justice system and the large numbers of young men being released into communities bearing the mark of a criminal record. We need to find these young men jobs.
Okay, so just to summarize, Pager's audit experiment demonstrated the causal effect of a criminal record, one that made it much more difficult for both white and black job seekers to get a callback. The study was also remarkable in that it demonstrated racial discrimination in hiring, how white men with a criminal record fared better in her study than black men without a criminal record. At the end of the video clip, Pager had discussed the Ban the Box initiative, which I want to touch on just briefly here. So Ban the Box laws are laws that try to prevent employers, public employers and sometimes also private employers, for asking job applicants about their criminal history. So over the last few years, about 35 states have passed some form of a Ban the Box initiative. And the general purpose of these laws is to try to make it easier for people who have a criminal record to get back into the labor force. However, recent research has investigated the efficacy of these initiatives, and that research has been a bit mixed. Some of the research shows that Ban the Box laws have been effective in eliminating the discrepancy in callback rates between those with a criminal record and those without. However, many studies also show a pretty unintended consequence of these laws, which is that Ban the Box initiatives seem to reduce the likelihood of Black and Latino men getting callbacks at all. So these findings suggest that when employers don't have information about someone's criminal history, they may make hiring decisions just based on their perception of the likelihood that the applicant has a criminal history. Or to put it differently, racism and harmful stereotypes may skew perceptions by employers against young men of color. So the graph here shows the result from one of these analyses, with callback rates for Black men decreasing actually after ban the box was passed. So mass incarceration and the policing which generates it also has had major effects on the individuals and communities that are policed. So as we've seen in the wake of protests over the murder of George Floyd this summer, scholars and community advocates are increasingly drawing attention to racial disparities in policing and disparities in the use of police force. So to get data that generates estimates on police violence it's a notoriously difficult thing. So, and part of the reason for this is because there's no real national database of police reports. But also, there's difficulty in the data of police reports themselves, whether or not that data is always accurate or whether or not it's always filled out. So it's only been in relatively recent years that better data and consequently better studies are becoming available to understand police violence. For instance, scholars estimate now that more than 1,100 people are killed in the United States each year through police shootings or through other forms of police force. In addition, a study that appeared in the journal Nature, which is one of the top science journals in the world, estimated that Black men had more than twice the risk of being killed by police than white men. Importantly, police shootings occur in both large cities as well as in suburban and rural areas. In fact, this graph shows that the rate of fatal shootings by police depends upon population size. And actually that in more rural areas and in small cities, fatal shooting by police occur at higher rates than what you see in large cities. So recent studies have tried to understand how changing and diversifying the police force might mitigate the use of violence by police officers. So for instance, there's evidence that Black officers are less likely to use a gun when answering 911 calls than white officers. And there's also new evidence that diversifying police forces by gender could lower the use of force in general. So these are results from a study of Chicago's police department that show that female officers are substantially less likely to use force relative to male police officers. Okay, so finally, I assigned for class today an interview with the sociologist Pat Sharkey entitled How Cities Can Tackle Violent Crime Without Relying on Police. The piece discusses that although research in criminology has demonstrated that policing can reduce violent crime, policing can also come at a high cost to over-policed communities. So in this piece, Sharkey discusses his book, An Easy Peace, and ideas and strategies for how investments can be made into communities in order to find solutions other than incarceration. Okay, so we are going to stop here for today. Next week, we're going to move on from this big unit we've had on social institutions, and we're going to start talking about social change. That is, how can individuals go about changing these institutions that we've discussed over the last weeks? We'll spend a whole week and a half discussing social movements, how they arise, and when they are successful. So looking forward to seeing you all next week.